Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. In answer to the challenge Ralph Nader laid down in the first half of our show, we have Brink Lindsey, Vice President of Research at the Cato Institute and author of numerous books held in high regard in the libertarian community, including Age of Abundance, Against the Dead Hand, and Human Capitalism. Brink, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Brink, I understand that you are hosting a book forum later this month with Ralph Nader to review his book Unstoppable and his proposed alliance between the left and the right. He, in fact, called you out by name in his book as a quintessential libertarian. What do you make of his program?
Yes, we met about a year or so ago, and as he was undertaking this new plan for a left-right alliance, and I told him the things that I thought were good ideas and the things that I didn't think were going to attract people like me. But in general, I am warmly supportive of his project and am happy to help Cato provide a forum for his putting forward the idea of a left-right alliance on a number of issues. What those specific issues are, we can disagree about later, but in general, libertarians are a fairly small minority in American politics, so when anybody reaches out to us, I think we ought to be hospitable.
Do you agree with his diagnosis that we've got primarily dysfunction in Washington today?
We certainly have dysfunction in Washington today. We had it yesterday. We'll have it tomorrow. And I do think that he has identified, as a political entrepreneur, real targets of opportunity where principled outsiders from both the left and the right can agree that they have a common enemy in a corrupt and overreaching Washington establishment, and that this kind of outsider insurgency does have the potential to shake things up in constructive ways.
He definitely characterizes this as an alliance of opportunity, not a long-term effort to build a party.
Yes, I think that's completely correct, and certainly on many of these issues there may be a convergence of interests, but that doesn't mean that there's some sort of deep underlying either ideological or cultural affinity that would actually produce a coherent political movement.
Before we get into the politics of trust and whether or not a large tent can be erected, maybe we can go into a few of the issues that he highlights. He actually calls out 24 specific issues in his book. Where would you start?
I'll start with the issues where progressives and libertarians have historically been most aligned, and that is in the areas of civil liberties, foreign policy, defense spending. So I think it is rare in Washington to find anyone who has a deep principled skepticism about power. Ralph Nader has deep principled skepticism about power. What he identifies as the most problematic kinds of power is different from me. His conception of power is different from mine, so he's much more worried about corporate power than I am. I'm much more worried about government power than he is. But someone who can, across the board, be worried about unchecked power and the threat it poses to the individual is someone with whom I can do business and with whom libertarians ought to be able to do business on particular issues. And these days, there is no area, I think, of more sort of threatening unchecked power than in the NSA surveillance state. And so progressives like Ralph and libertarians at Cato can certainly make common cause on that. Likewise, on a gigantic bloated defense budget, which is in turn a function of an incredibly ambitious program of American involvement in every dispute around the world. Libertarians and progressives, at least some progressives, can agree on that. Here, I would stress to Ralph's credit how he opposed the Patriot Act when Bush was enforcing it, and he opposes it when Obama's enforcing it.
Which is unusual, because most folks will pick one president and support him, and Ralph doesn't seem to care about that.
And what we've seen in opinion polls is that worries about surveillance, the level has not changed that dramatically, but the composition of the worriers has changed. It was liberals under Bush, and it's conservatives under Obama.
Now, you talk about NSA surveillance, and you talk about foreign adventurism in the military. Hasn't Rand Paul made these very same comments?
Sure he has, and I think there are people on the left who, in spite of themselves, find themselves attracted to some parts of Rand Paul's message, because he is resonating with a long-standing concern on the left. Beyond these civil liberties and foreign policy matters, there is also the issue of corporate welfare or crony capitalism. So the fusion of corporate power and government power for the enrichment of corporate interests. That's something that, of course, libertarians, as deeply skeptical about government involvement in the economy, can get behind, and someone like Ralph Nader, who's deeply suspicious of corporate power, can get behind as well. So for different reasons, we can get together and oppose these kinds of measures.
And apparently so can Grover Norquist.
Yes.
And so the pork barrel politicians of both parties are the ones who would end up being the target of those kind of activities.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's likely to get any traction?
I think on issues here and there, we can see possibilities for real change. Certainly, the overall budget situation is one that is unsustainable. We have this yawning gap between the resources coming in and the resources going out, and that contradiction will eventually have to be resolved. One hopes that it will be resolved by reducing government spending in the areas where the claims for it are the weakest, and certainly subsidies for well-heeled corporations are about the weakest case you can have for government involvement. So one could hope, and there is good reason to think, that there will be downward pressure on government spending, and so we hope that we can translate that general pressure into focused reform in this area.
Let's drill down on one very problematic sector, which is the too-big-to-fail banks. We've gone through some years of real pain watching the government try to recapitalize the banks at taxpayers' expense. Ralph has some very strong views on how they should be run as public utilities. I would suspect that Cato and the Libertarian side of the alliance would have a somewhat different approach to solving the too-big-to-fail bank problem.
Sure. So certainly the first best solution of most libertarians would be completely different from anything that along the lines that Ralph Nader has suggested. There are libertarian free market economists who, as a kind of 14th best solution, seeing the just deep politicization of the financial sector and how deep in history that has run, despair of having a truly free market banking system in which banks, like any other businesses,
are allowed to fail.
And so there is some sympathy to caps on bank size if we just give up and assume that these banks are going to be bailed out if they're sufficiently large.
Well, what's the first best solution?
I don't think I'm the right guy to give you a first best solution. I think finance is complicated. I think the possibilities of bank runs and systemic risk are not to be discounted out of hand. And so, in general, I would rely much more on the use of market forces to discipline market actors rather than presuming that if you just have the right guys in charge of the regulatory agency and they're just blessed with enough power that they're going to make everything all right. The financial crisis was presented by progressives as a failure of run-amok capitalism, that we had deregulation of the financial sector. And
that's their narrative.
And that's the narrative. And yet the fact is the financial sector is one of the most heavily regulated sectors in our economy. It was before the financial crisis. And those regulators, it wasn't a story of greedy bankers trying to sell mortgages to people who couldn't afford them and prudent regulators trying to stop them but being unable to. Everybody was in the tank for this idea of eternally
ownership.
That home ownership is great and that housing prices are just going to keep going up forever. And so I think public sector and private sector were both blind to the risks that we're building in the housing sector. So I think the simple moralistic narrative of government regulation good, free market banks bad, has nothing to do with what really happened, and any policy response based on that narrative is likely to make matters even worse rather than better.
Which is the typical solution in Washington.
Indeed.
It seems to be where we're heading right now with Dodd-Frank.
Yes.
Let's push a little further into telecom policy. I had some interesting exchanges with Ralph about that. He had conveniently forgotten his efforts to keep commercial traffic from coming onto the internet back in the 90s. And then went on to assert that we really should re-regulate the telecom industry and run it as it was back during the days of Ma Bell. How would libertarians take to that?
Well, I wish Ralph Nader of the current decade would get in touch with his inner Ralph Nader from the 1970s, who was very familiar with the concept of regulatory capture, that when you do regulate businesses as public utilities, all the information about how to regulate them sits in the heads of the business people. They've got all the data that they have to share with regulators, and so they control the whole process. And what ends up happening is that regulation is run for the benefit of incumbent firms and to make sure that they are profitable and that they have an easy life of things and to keep out any kind of disruption from messy entrepreneurship and competition.
Yeah, government-approved tariffs.
So seeing that particularly in the transportation sector, Ralph Nader was a champion for deregulation of both airlines and trucking. And the lessons that he learned back then still apply today. So the idea of reviving the long discredited conception that we can run industries in the public interest by subjecting them to cartelistic kind of regulation. Reviving that bad idea is just going to get us nowhere.
He seems to be hanging his hat on the net neutrality war cry. Where do you come down on that?
So,
and remind our audience what that is.
So the issue is that basically that there aren't different charges for different levels of service.
Should be a dump pipe.
The fear on the part of net neutrality supporters is that big businesses will get preferential access to the internet and little guys will get priced out, and that the wonderful sort of open Wild West that we have on the internet today will be closed off by the exercise of corporate
power. Channelized like cable TV.
So I don't think that those concerns are completely without merit. I think there are possibilities of negative developments in the way the internet is run, but in general, I remain quite skeptical that a heavier hand of FCC regulation is going to be the way to preserve the internet in its current form.
Usually the clamor of consumers tends to be heard pretty loudly by people who want their money, so you'd think there'd be a balance in the marketplace.
Yes. So in business, when you have a bad idea, your customers all run away and you go bankrupt. In government, when you have a bad idea, you've got a really solid case that I need even more money to make this work.
To keep doing what I've been doing. You drill down a little bit into Ralph's understanding of economics, and he in fact did concede that his big problem is with bigness. Bigness is evil in and of itself. It seems to be his program. And in trying to form an alliance with libertarians, how is he going to sell that message?
Yeah, so that message just isn't going to sell. I think fundamental to Ralph Nader's history as a critic of corporate power is a conception of the corporation that I just fundamentally don't share. So first of all, he sees the limited liability status as basically a privilege or a favor granted for the state, along with which there ought to be obligations to serve the public interest. I don't see limited liability as a privilege or a favor, and we could get into the details of that.
That's actually a fascinating discussion, because that's different than the right of free speech or the right of peaceable assembly. The right to be limited in how much pain you suffer when the company you own goes down or harms others is a creation of the courts and of the legislature.
So this idea that corporate personhood is this legal fiction and a privilege granted by the state to corporations and corporate investors. So basically, if a bunch of people got together, not under the corporate form, but made deals with everybody they contracted with, that only the assets of this enterprise are eligible for satisfying our debts, every contractor could agree with that. That's just limited liability. So there's nothing special that corporate personhood is doing other than streamlining something
Making
that everybody
one size fits all.
Streamlining something that everybody has an interest in doing anyway.
Like marriage.
So meanwhile, there's a tougher question about limited liability for torts, for harms caused by a corporation to third parties.
Let's say pollution.
Yeah, or let's take the Walmart driver who hit the Tracy Morgan's car earlier this week. Those third parties didn't make any deal with the corporation to limit their claims against the corporation. So there's a possibility that, okay, maybe the corporation is getting away with something by only having corporate assets be eligible for satisfying claims. But look, the issue here in tort is somebody's at fault. So who is in fault when that Walmart truck plowed into Tracy Morgan's van? Well, certainly the driver. Maybe the supervisors and the corporate managers who
shouldn't have had them out on the road.
Who produced the schedules that had people driving too many hours a day. But is everybody in Walmart, every employee in Walmart, hundreds of thousands, over 1 million people, are they at fault for what this one truck driver did? I don't know. Are the millions of passive investors who know nothing about what happened here at all, are they really at fault when this truck hit this van, and should they face personal bankruptcy? Did they do something wrong that they should pay that kind of penalty? It doesn't make sense to me at all that they are blameworthy. So to me, the idea of expanding liability for this harm beyond the actual individual perpetrators and their supervisors to the all the assets of a gigantic corporate enterprise, seems to me, rather than a move to restrict liability and to favor corporate enterprise, is actually expanding liability beyond what a stricter conception of fault might point. So to me, on the contracting side and on the tort side, the limited liability corporate personhood feature does not look like a favor. It looks like justice and looks like just a default option for contracting.
And everybody knows what the rules are.
And everybody
so it's
knows,
transparent.
and on the contracting side, everybody knows what the rules are, and that's fine. So on this fundamental issue of corporate personhood and limited liability, Ralph Nader sees privilege, favoritism, and therefore wants a quid pro quo. I don't. So we just fundamentally disagree. Beyond that, as you mentioned, I think Ralph Nader sees bigness as fundamentally suspect.
He's definitely Jeffersonian rather than Hamiltonian in his conception of what commerce should look like. We should have little shops. We should all be individual entrepreneurs. 50 people is as many as you ever need in a company. That seems to be his idyllic economy.
Yes, and this harkens back to debates that occurred late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century with the emergence of giant industrial enterprises. There were people who just thought that these things are just too big and we should break them up, and they imagined the good old days of small yeoman artisans and small-scale enterprise. But the fact is, the scale at which economic activity can be conducted most efficiently varies from industry to industry and time to time, and sometimes that scale is whopping and huge. And so the best way to serve consumers is through an enterprise of large scale. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's something wonderful about achieving those economies of scale so that you can give a better life to more people at lower cost.
Let's dwell on that a minute, because the rich and the very rich could always get everything they want out of artisans. Only today, when we have large-scale enterprises, when we have a semiconductor industry that's enormous, when we have a Walmart, can the poor get the same kind of goods that only were available to the rich in the past? Why is it so hard for progressives to see that?
I barely understand, why I think the things I do. It's very difficult for me to jump into other people's brains and understand why they think the things they do. But certainly there are plenty of stories of victims and bad business actors, and so you see an individual victim and you see a corporate malefactor, and that narrative is appealing to people. It makes a certain intuitive sense, even if in the bigger picture, the invention of the corporation, I think, is one of the great technological advances in human history. It allowed the pooling of assets on a large scale to take advantage of these potentials for economies of scale. It led to the triumph over poverty that we've seen in the 20th century. The corporate form played a big part in that story. So to me, just a kind of knee-jerk opposition to bigness is ultimately a knee-jerk opposition to modernity, and it's reactionary and it's ill-considered.
You wrote a paper back in 2006 at the height of Bush fatigue. So you have to take your mind where we are today with Obama fatigue and remember that we were just as tired of the last guy. And let me quote from your paper. It says, progressives remain stubbornly resistant to embracing capitalism, their great natural ally. Why do you consider it their great natural ally?
Well, at the time, I wrote this piece for the New Republic back in 2006, and I didn't make up the title, but the headline writer called it Liberaltarians, and the idea was that I was trying to put across was that liberals and progressives have more in common than we realize, and in 2006, in the years of Bush fatigue, that message had a certain resonance. But I wrote this on the eve of the publication of a book of mine called The Age of Abundance, which made the argument that capitalist mass affluence had huge impacts on our culture as well as our politics. And in particular, it had pushed American society in a much more socially liberal direction. I link economic development and mass affluence to the civil rights revolution, to feminism, to environmentalism, to hedonism, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the sexual revolution, all of which were developments that the left championed and that the left is historically associated with. And yet, in the telling of the story that I do in this book, none of them would have been possible without the predicate of capitalist mass affluence.
Which basically makes all of these liberal desires luxury goods, which means we have to all get rich first.
That's one way of looking at it. And so in the story I told, that here you have all of these cultural upheavals of the 60s and 70s that are being championed by the left, but made possible by the capitalism and sort of bourgeois middle-class values that they despised at the time. Meanwhile, jumping to the defense of capitalism and middle-class values was a traditionalist conservatism that defended them as of a piece with all other received traditions, including traditional attitudes about women and race and sexuality. So
both sides had it wrong.
And so you had a battle of the half-blind versus the half-blind. It's people who are condemning capitalism while gobbling up its fruits on the left, and people who are praising capitalism and defending it while proclaiming that its fruits are toxic on the right. And that's where we are.
So libertarians, in fact, you in particular, have been reaching out to both the left and the right for some time with mixed success. I think in the common mind today, libertarianism is more associated with elements of the Tea Party than it is with Ralph Nader's neck of the woods. How is that changing?
Yeah, well, when I wrote this piece that we talked about earlier, Liberaltarians, where I was trying to make common cause between libertarians and progressives, something that now Ralph Nader is reciprocating, I noticed a real asymmetry in libertarians' political activities, that libertarians see themselves as beyond left and right, that they're not conservatives on social issues and personal freedom and foreign policy, and they're not progressives when it comes to economics. They're something completely different. And yet, operationally, libertarians have cooperated much more closely, engaged much more deeply with conservatives on their shared interest in free market economics than they have with progressives on their shared interest in personal freedoms, civil liberties, and
Why is
foreign
that?
policy.
Because there's more money on that side?
I think it's an artifact of the time in which the modern libertarian movement arose. It arose during the Cold War, when the big issue that had cleaved classical liberals from modern liberals was socialism. And so classical liberals, which is another word for libertarians, saw that liberalism had completely gone off the deep end by embracing centralized planning and massive expansions of government power. And so their primary focus was on stopping socialism. And so it was natural that they would make alliances with anti-socialist conservatives on the right, because the primary issue was socialism, both domestically and then in the Cold War internationally. I think with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the passing of central planning, comprehensive central planning as any kind of viable ideal, that this leaning to the right is outdated, and that we are just as out of sync with the right on a bunch of very important issues as we are with the left on a bunch of important issues. And yet with the right, we're able to do all kinds of cooperative stuff on economic issues while submerging our differences and not talking about them, or talking about them politely. And we've not done nearly as good a job on the left, and that's where growth opportunities seem to me to be ripest. So after social liberalism had kind of gone in abeyance in the 80s and 90s after thrashings by Republicans at the polls, and you had Clinton moving socially to the right as well as economically, we've now seen a real reemergence of social liberalism in gay marriage and in marijuana legalization. We're starting to see interesting left-right alliances on prison reform. So I think that a libertarian liberalism is emerging, and libertarians would do well to applaud that, welcome it, encourage it in any way they can.
Can you libertarians build a bridge between the left and the right when it comes to the folks that you've been making common cause with?
Yeah, I certainly, people at Cato work all the time. People at Cato who work on civil liberties or on foreign policy do absolutely reach out to and work constructively with their colleagues on the left. And that's in the tiny egghead world of think tanks. More broadly, I think we are, as I just mentioned, in the prison reform subject, you've got really interesting conservatives and evangelical movements that have focused on the problems of mass incarceration and the futility of and just horrors of having 2 million Americans behind bars. And they find sympathetic voices on the left who have long worried about such matters. So I think there are real opportunities for convergence. This is not to gainsay real, deep, durable ideological differences, but those differences don't preclude getting together and getting things done in a positive direction on an issue-by-issue basis.
Ironically enough, Ralph ends his book, despite his problem with bigness and his problem with money in politics, he ends his book trying to reach out for a savior billionaire to come and fund his movement. And I tease him a little bit and suggest that he go talk to the Koch brothers. The Kochs have funded Cato in the past and today. and seem to be carrying some water there. Do you think they could get interested in Ralph's movement?
Oh, I certainly would not presume to speak for the Kochs. And for my part, the reliance on the white knight, the politician who's
George Soros,
the politician is going to come from somewhere, whether he be a billionaire or something else. The idea of a savior to me just seems very sort of old-fashioned and naive and wrong.
Well, it's usually it's a general, not a billionaire.
So I think constructive change tends to happen from the bottom up, and that politicians are a lagging rather than leading indicator. And so I don't look for salvation from leaders.
So Brink, tell us about this book forum that you're holding for Ralph, and what's the plan?
So Ralph will be speaking about his book, Unstoppable, and we've got as commenters two very bright conservative writers who have some natural sympathy with parts of Ralph's agenda. We have Daniel McCarthy, who's the editor of The American Conservative. He has long been highly critical of neoconservative approaches to foreign policy. And so I think he will speak about the possibilities of left-right alliances on foreign policy and defense spending. We also have Tim Carney, who's a columnist for the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His beat is corporate welfare and crony capitalism and the corrupt nexus between big business and government. So he has lots to say about the possibilities of left-right alliances against that problem. So I think it should be a really interesting show. Again, there's a real man bites dog quality to the Cato Institute hosting Ralph Nader for a book event.
And when is this, and will you be live streaming it?
It's on Friday, June 27th at noon, and we will be live streaming, and the video will be archived as well.
At cato.org.
At cato.org.
Brink, thanks so much for being on the show.
I enjoyed it very much.
That wraps up our show for this week. You've been listening to Brink Lindsey from the Cato Institute answering Ralph Nader's challenge here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. See you next week.